The first morning after the wedding was quiet, just like every morning in the valley. But for Henry, everything felt different. He opened his eyes before the sun had fully risen. The soft light came through the window and painted golden lines on the wooden floor of the cabin. He lay there for a few seconds listening. The river was still flowing outside. The wind was still whispering through the trees. And the birds were singing the same songs they always had. But now, there was a soft breathing next to him. Emily. She was sleeping peacefully, her head resting gently on the pillow, her hair spread out like a soft shadow. For years, Henry had woken up to the sound of silence, the weight of emptiness and the cool air of a cabin that belonged to only him. But this morning there was warmth beside him. Real, quiet warmth. He turned slightly, careful not to wake her. For a moment, he simply looked at her. The woman who had walked into his life through a rainstorm, who had spoken to him with kindness when he had forgotten how to speak, who had brought light into a place that had been quiet for far too long. It didn't feel like a dream anymore. It was real. She was here. Henry slipped out of bed softly and stepped outside. The air was crisp and cool, and a soft mist rose from the river. The mountain stood tall and golden in the early sunlight. Everything looked the same as it always had, but it felt like seeing the world through new eyes. The porch creaked under his feet, and he wrapped his old jacket around his shoulders. He had always started his mornings alone, but not anymore. A few minutes later, Emily joined him on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. She yawned softly, her hair a little messy from sleep, but her eyes bright and warm. "You're up early," she said, smiling. "I always am," Henry replied with a gentle laugh. "Old habit." She leaned against the railing, looking at the misty valley. "It's beautiful here," she whispered. Henry looked at her instead of the valley. "Yes," he said softly. "It is." They shared a quiet breakfast that morning, warm bread, honey, and tea. Simple things. But now even the simplest things felt new. The silence was no longer a wall. It was a warm space they shared. Emily had never tried to change Henry's world. She had become a part of it. And he in turn had opened the door of his heart in a way he once thought was impossible. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of their life slowly settled into something gentle and real. Henry still chopped wood in the mornings. He still carried water from the river, tended his small garden, and fixed things when they broke. But now Emily worked beside him. She laughed while gathering herbs, hummed softly when hanging laundry, and told stories while they cooked dinner together in the evenings. She loved the forest as much as he did. She didn't need a city full of lights to feel alive. She found her joy in the rustle of the leaves, the songs of birds, and the calm of the river. Some evenings they sat by the fire outside the cabin, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars fill the sky. She often leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her without needing to say a single word. The forest, which had once been Henry's silent friend, now echoed with their shared laughter and quiet conversations. Even the animals seemed to grow used to the sound of two people living in harmony with the land. Deer often wandered close, rabbits came near the garden, and birds built nests on the trees around their home. One morning, as autumn deepened and the leaves turned gold and red, Henry watched Emily picking apples from the small tree near the cabin. She wore a simple blue dress and smiled up at the sky as if she were greeting the season itself. Henry stood at a distance watching her, feeling something soft and powerful rise in his chest. He had thought his story had ended a long time ago, but now he realized that sometimes life waits patiently to give you a second chapter when you least expect it. Emily noticed him watching and laughed. "What are you looking at?" "You," he answered simply, smiling. She shook her head playfully. "You're supposed to help me, not just stand there." He walked over, picked an apple, and handed it to her. Their hands brushed, and even after all these weeks, that small touch still made his heart feel alive. It wasn't a wild, rushing feeling. It was steady, strong, like the mountains around them. They built new routines together. Emily taught him how to bake new things in the old wood stove. He showed her how to find hidden paths in the forest that only he knew. She started growing more vegetables in the garden, and he built a small bench near the river so they could sit together in the evenings. Their lives didn't change overnight. They grew slowly, like a tree stretching its branches toward the sun. Sometimes, when they walked down the trail to the small town at the bottom of the mountain, people would smile when they saw them. The locals had heard stories about the mountain man who lived alone for 10 years. Now they saw him walking hand in hand with a woman, both of them laughing softly. Some found it surprising, others found it beautiful. But Henry didn't care what they thought. All that mattered was the quiet joy that filled his heart every day. Winter came slowly that year. The first snow fell lightly, covering the ground like a white blanket. In the past, winter had always been the hardest season for Henry. Long nights, cold mornings, and endless silence. But this time, winter felt different. The cabin was filled with warmth, not just from the fire, but from their shared presence. They spent evenings wrapped in blankets, reading books, telling stories, and watching the snow fall outside. Emily loved watching the snowflakes, saying each one looked like a tiny piece of magic. Henry loved watching her. Some nights, the wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, their laughter and soft voices made everything feel safe and warm. They decorated the cabin with small candles and pine branches, making it feel more alive than ever before. As the months passed, their bond only grew stronger. They weren't just two people living together. They were building a life side by side. Henry was no longer the man who hid from the world. He was a man who had found something worth opening his heart for again. One evening, as the snow melted and spring returned, Henry and Emily sat on the bench by the river. The air was cool but gentle, and the water sparkled in the setting sun. Emily rested her head against his shoulder, and Henry wrapped his arm around her. The forest was alive again with the sound of birds, just as it had been on the day they first met. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" she asked softly. "Every day," Henry replied. "A storm, a stranger, and a cabin in the middle of nowhere." Emily smiled. "Not a stranger anymore," he nodded slowly. "No, not anymore." He thought about the man he had been, quiet, alone, hidden in the shadow of his own pain. And then he thought about the man he was now, still quiet but no longer alone. The difference was everything. Emily turned to him and took his hand. "You know what I love most about this place?" she asked. "What?" he asked. "It's not just the forest. It's the way everything feels real here, simple, honest. It's like the world slows down just enough for us to breathe." Henry smiled softly. "That's what I love about you." The river moved steadily, the forest wrapped around them like a warm blanket, and the sun painted the sky in soft colors. Henry had lived for 10 years without expecting anything new. He had accepted a life of silence. But love had found its way to him quietly, like a breeze moving through trees, gentle but powerful enough to change everything. Over the years, their story became part of the valley. Travelers sometimes passed through hearing about the man who lived alone and the woman who found him. Some stopped to visit the cabin. Emily always welcomed them with a warm smile, offering them bread or tea. Henry, though still quiet, no longer shied away from conversation. He had learned that silence was beautiful, but sharing it with someone made it even more meaningful. Every night, when the stars filled the sky, Henry and Emily would sit on the porch together. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. But either way, they understood each other perfectly. Henry often thought about how one rainstorm had brought Emily to his door. He thought about how a single smile had slowly pulled him out of the walls he had built. And he thought about how love didn't arrive with noise or speed. It arrived quietly, like the soft light of dawn. Years later, the valley remained the same. Calm, wild, beautiful. But Henry was no longer just a man hidden away in the forest. He was a husband, a friend, a part of a love story that had grown like the trees around them, slowly, but with deep roots. The mountains had given him silence, but Emily had given that silence meaning. As they watched the stars together one night, Henry whispered softly, "I never thought I'd have this again." Emily squeezed his hand gently. "That's the beauty of life," she said. "It surprises us when we least expect it." And so, beneath the endless sky, their story lived on. A story not of loud promises or grand moments, but of quiet mornings, warm smiles, and two hearts that found their way to each other in the stillness of the mountains. The valley was full of soft gold light as the sun began to set. The trees glowed like they were holding pieces of sunlight in their leaves. A gentle breeze carried the sweet smell of pine and wildflowers across the land. Summer was slowly turning into autumn, and the air had that familiar coolness that made the evenings quiet and calm. Henry Whitlock stood on the porch of his cabin, his hands resting on the old wooden railing. He looked out over the valley where everything had begun to change, not the forest, but his life. Only a few months ago, his world had been built on silence and routine. Now that silence had been replaced by laughter, gentle conversations and footsteps that came down the forest trail more often than he ever expected. Emily had become a part of his days, not by force, but like sunlight slipping gently through a window. Sometimes she came with a backpack and a smile, sometimes with a book or a story from town. She never stayed too long, but when she was there, everything felt a little warmer. That evening, Henry was waiting for her again. She had said she would come. He didn't know why this time felt different, but something inside him told him that today mattered more than other days. He adjusted the old lantern on the porch, straightened the table a little, and brushed the wood dust from his shirt. He didn't even notice how careful he was being, but Emily had quietly given him something he hadn't felt in years: the desire to make things beautiful again. Not long after, he heard it, the soft sound of footsteps on the trail. His heart beat a little faster. He turned his head and saw her walking toward him, her hair shining softly in the fading sunlight. She was wearing a light dress and carried a small bag. She looked happy, almost glowing with the kind of joy that made everything else seem lighter. "You're early," Henry said softly. "I couldn't wait," she answered with a little laugh. She climbed the porch steps and handed him something wrapped in a cloth. "I made this," she said. Inside was a loaf of warm bread still smelling fresh from the oven. Henry smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. He didn't smile like that often, but Emily had a way of making it easy. They sat on the porch together, watching the sun sink behind the peaks. The sky slowly changed from gold to orange, then to soft pink and purple. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something special. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of gentle understanding. Emily turned to him, her eyes thoughtful. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "Miss what?" Henry replied. "The world out there. The noise, the lights, the people." Henry thought for a long moment. The question went deep. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not the way people think. I don't miss the crowds. I don't miss the noise. But I miss the feeling of being part of something. I thought that part of my life was over a long time ago." Emily looked at him carefully. "And now?" He met her eyes. "Now. I'm not so sure anymore." She didn't say anything right away. She reached out her hand and placed it gently on top of his. Her hand was warm. Henry froze for a second, not because he didn't like it, but because he hadn't felt something so simple and kind in such a long time. It felt both strange and familiar, like remembering a song he once loved. The evening grew darker. Fireflies appeared, dancing around them in small glowing circles. Emily leaned back on the railing and looked at the stars beginning to show. "This place feels like magic," she whispered. "But it's not just the forest. It's you too, Henry. You make it feel alive." Henry didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't used to hearing words like those. For years he had thought of himself as a shadow in the woods, someone forgotten by the world. And now someone was sitting next to him, calling him part of something beautiful. It made his chest feel full, almost too full to breathe. Then Emily did something that surprised him. She opened her small bag and took out a folded piece of paper. "I want to show you something," she said. She spread the paper out on the table between them. It was a sketch she had drawn: the cabin, the trees, the river, and the tall peaks in the distance. But there was more. In the drawing, the cabin wasn't just a quiet wooden house. It was decorated with flowers, lanterns, and a small group of people standing around a wooden arch. Henry stared at it, confused. "What's this?" Emily's cheeks grew a little pink. She smiled nervously but kept her eyes steady. "It's just something I imagined. A small wedding? Here." Henry's heart skipped a beat. A wedding? That was a word he hadn't let himself think about in a decade. It felt far away, like another life. Emily kept speaking softly. "I've thought about how simple and beautiful it would be here. Just a few people, no noise. Just the forest, the river, and the sky. Everything real." Henry didn't move for a moment. The image on the paper felt unreal and yet somehow familiar, like a dream he had almost forgotten. A wedding was not something he had ever imagined again for himself. Not after all the years of silence. But looking at Emily's smile, it didn't feel like a faraway dream anymore. It felt close, possible. "Why did you draw this?" he asked, his voice quiet. Emily took a breath. "Because this place feels like home. And because you feel like someone who could be part of that home." Her words settled in the air like soft snow. Henry looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't a passing hiker anymore. She wasn't a visitor who would disappear when the storm cleared. She was someone who had quietly walked into his life step by step without pushing. And now she was giving him a choice, and not forcing it, but offering it gently. Henry stood up and walked a few steps away, looking at the trees. His chest felt tight. He remembered the life he had left behind, the woman he had loved, the pain of losing everything, and he also remembered the years of silence, of choosing not to feel too much because it was easier that way. But now, standing under the stars with Emily's sketch on the table, and her voice still echoing softly in his ears, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time, the courage to imagine again. He turned back to her. Emily was still sitting there, waiting. She wasn't pushing him for an answer. Her eyes were calm, patient, full of trust. Henry walked closer. "Emily," he said quietly, "I don't know how to be the man I used to be." She shook her head gently. "I don't want the man you used to be. I want the man standing right here." His heart softened at those words. Something inside him finally let go of the fear he had been holding for so long. The night grew still. The stars shone brightly above them, like tiny candles scattered across the dark sky. The forest seemed to lean in closer, as if it too was listening. Henry took a deep breath. His voice was quiet but sure. "Then maybe we can build something together." Emily's eyes shone brighter than the lantern on the porch. She smiled, the kind of smile that carried a promise without needing a single extra word. A few weeks later, the valley was dressed in warm autumn colors. Leaves covered the ground in shades of gold and red. The air was cool, but the sun still warmed the tops of the trees. A small group of people, just a few close friends of Emily and a ranger from town, stood near the cabin. There were no big decorations, no loud music, no crowds, just flowers tied to the porch, lanterns hanging softly, and the sound of the wind moving through the forest. Henry stood near the wooden arch Emily had imagined in her drawing. His beard was trimmed and he wore a clean white shirt. His heart pounded, not with fear but with a kind of joy that felt quiet and strong, like the earth beneath his feet. When Emily walked toward him in a simple white dress, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Henry had spent 10 years in silence, 10 years without seeing a woman's face light up in front of him. And now here she was, walking toward him with a smile that reached the deepest corners of his heart. As she reached him, he whispered with a soft, honest laugh, "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years." She laughed too, tears shining in her eyes. "Well, I'm here now." And then, in the quiet of the forest, beneath the golden leaves, Henry leaned forward and kissed the bride. It was not a grand kiss, not the kind sung about in stories. It was gentle, full of meaning, the kind that closes one chapter and begins another. The ranger spoke the simple words that made their marriage real. There were no speeches, no loud cheers, just the wind, the river, and the forest as their witnesses. Henry and Emily stood hand in hand, their fingers fitting together like they were always meant to. As the sun set behind the mountains, their friends left, one by one, until the valley was quiet again. But this time the quiet wasn't empty. It was full of warmth, full of love. Henry looked at Emily and smiled softly. "You've changed everything," he whispered. She shook her head gently. "No, you just opened the door." And with the stars shining above them, Henry knew that this was not just another evening in the mountains. This was the beginning of a new life. The memory of that rainy day did not leave Henry's mind as quickly as the storm had left the valley. For the first time in 10 long years, someone had stepped into his quiet world. Their voices had echoed in his cabin. Their laughter had filled the air, and their soft footsteps had left prints on the wooden floor. And most of all, Henry remembered Emily's eyes, curious, kind, and full of life. After they left, the forest returned to its old silence. The wind moved through the trees just the way it always had. The river kept its same song. But to Henry, something felt different. The quiet that once gave him peace now felt a little heavier, as if it was missing a note in a familiar melody. For the first few days, Henry tried to push the thought away. He went back to his routine. He chopped wood early in the morning. He carried water from the river. He checked his traps and worked in his garden. But in the middle of his quiet tasks, he would suddenly remember the way Emily had smiled at the firelight, or the way she had said, "Thank you," with a warmth that made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. Late at night, when the stars covered the sky, he sat on the porch with his cup of warm tea and wondered if she had already forgotten him. She was from the world beyond these trees, the world he had left behind. People from that world moved fast. They didn't stay. They passed through like the wind. But Emily hadn't been like most people. She had noticed him. She had spoken gently, not with fear or judgment. That made a difference. And though Henry didn't want to admit it to himself, he found himself listening for footsteps that weren't there. Weeks passed. The valley turned from wet spring to early summer. The air grew warmer and the days became longer. The sun painted the forest gold every morning, and fireflies filled the night. Henry had lived through many summers alone, but this one felt different. Something inside him was awake now, something that had slept for a long time. Then one bright morning he heard a sound that made his heart skip a beat. Footsteps, real footsteps. Not the light patter of animals, not the sound of wind. Human footsteps. They were coming from the trail that led through the forest. Henry put down his axe and turned toward the sound, his breath catching in his chest. And then he saw her. Emily. She was walking up the path with a backpack over her shoulder, wearing a sun hat and boots. She looked tired but happy to see the valley again. When their eyes met, she smiled, a simple, bright smile that lit up her whole face. "Hi again," she said softly. Henry didn't know what to say at first. His heart beat harder than it had in a long time. "You came back," he finally managed to say. She laughed lightly. "Yes, I wanted to. I told my friends about this place, but they couldn't come, so I came alone." Henry nodded slowly. He wasn't sure why she had returned, but a small, warm feeling grew inside him. She stayed near the cabin for a few hours that day. They sat on the porch drinking warm tea together. At first, Henry didn't talk much. He had forgotten how to speak for long stretches of time. His voice felt strange to him, but Emily didn't mind his quietness. She spoke softly, telling him little stories about the town, the people she knew, and the way she loved nature. She told him how she worked as a guide in a small outdoor center. She helped tourists find trails and learn about the mountains. She had traveled to many places, but something about his valley had stayed in her heart. "It's peaceful here," she said, looking at the trees. "Like the world stands still for a little while." Henry listened carefully. He didn't have grand stories to tell. His life was simple, but when he did speak, his words were honest. He told her how he built the cabin with his own hands, how the seasons shaped his days, how silence had become his friend. And Emily listened too. She didn't look bored or restless. She looked like someone who was hearing something important. As the weeks passed, Emily returned again, and again. She didn't visit every day, but she came often enough that Henry began to expect it. Sometimes she brought fresh bread from town. Sometimes she brought seeds for his garden. Other times she brought nothing at all, just her presence, her voice, and her bright smile. They would walk through the forest together. She loved exploring the trails, and Henry showed her places even the hikers never found. A hidden stream, a hill with a perfect view of the sunset, a small meadow full of wildflowers. Emily would laugh when the wind touched her face, and Henry would quietly watch her, amazed by how someone could make the valley feel new again. Slowly, a friendship began to grow between them. Henry started talking more. His voice grew less rough. He told her about his past, about the woman he had loved and lost, and why he had chosen the mountains. Emily listened without interrupting. She didn't try to change his story. She simply held it gently as if it mattered. One afternoon, as they sat near the river, she turned to him and said, "You're not as alone as you think, Henry. Sometimes people find each other in the quietest places." Her words touched something deep in him. He didn't answer, but she didn't need him to. Emily's visits also changed the way Henry saw his own life. The chores he used to do out of habit now carried a quiet excitement. He swept the porch, fixed broken steps, and made small improvements to the cabin. He didn't do it for himself. He did it because he knew she might come. And when she did, he wanted everything to be warm and welcoming. Even the silence changed. Before, silence had been his shield. Now it became a space where two people could sit together without needing to fill it with words. But along with this new warmth came something Henry hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not the fear of danger. A different kind of fear. The fear of caring again. He had built a life where nothing could hurt him anymore. No goodbyes. No losses. No expectations. But now Emily's presence had opened a door in his heart. And doors once opened can let both light and wind in. One night, as the stars shone brightly, Henry lay awake in his cabin. He thought about how easily people could disappear. How she could one day stop coming, just like everyone else in his life had left. The thought made his chest tighten. He wasn't used to needing someone's presence. The next time Emily came, he was quieter than usual. She noticed right away. "What's wrong?" she asked gently. Henry shook his head. I don't know how to do this anymore," he said softly. "Do what?" she asked. "Be close to someone," he admitted, his voice low and uncertain. "It's been a long time." Emily didn't rush to answer. She stepped closer and looked into his eyes. "You don't have to know everything right now," she said softly. "We can just be here, one day at a time." And for some reason, those simple words were enough to ease something inside him. Their friendship grew stronger over time. They built small routines together. She would bring him small things from town, a book, a new cup, or just stories from the outside world. He would show her how to track animal prints, how to build a fire with a single spark, how to read the sky. They learned from each other, not just about the world, but about themselves. Henry learned that silence doesn't have to mean emptiness. Emily learned that stillness can hold its own kind of beauty. Sometimes they would sit on the porch together as the sun went down. No words, just the soft glow of light and the sound of the forest. And in those moments, Henry felt something he hadn't felt in so long that he almost didn't recognize it. Hope. One evening, after she left, he found himself looking at the small wooden box where he kept old memories. Inside was the picture of his past, the woman he once loved. For the first time in 10 years, he looked at it without feeling the sharp sting of pain. Instead, he felt a gentle sadness and a quiet acceptance. He whispered softly to the picture, "It's okay." And then he closed the box, not to hide it away, but to let it rest. Emily had not erased his past. She had simply reminded him that life didn't end where the pain began. And somewhere deep inside, Henry knew something was changing. Slowly, carefully, a door was opening wider. A new story was being written, not with grand gestures or loud promises, but with quiet steps, warm smiles, and the steady heartbeat of two lives slowly coming closer together. The storm came quietly at first. It began with a whisper of wind moving through the trees and a slight darkening of the clouds above the mountains. Henry Whitlock had lived in this place long enough to recognize the signs. He knew when the air changed and when a soft wind meant something bigger was coming. He stood on the small porch of his cabin, looking toward the west where the gray sky was slowly swallowing the soft blue. The forest around him was calm, almost too calm. Even the birds had gone quiet. He tightened his old wool jacket around his shoulders and took a deep breath. A storm was coming for sure, and it would not be a small one. Henry was ready. He had lived through storms for 10 years. He had food, firewood, and a warm cabin. But what he didn't know was that this storm would bring something unexpected. Someone unexpected. Several miles away, a group of hikers walked along a narrow trail, winding through tall pine trees and rocky paths. Among them was Emily Rhodes. She was in her late 20s, with a soft smile and curious eyes that noticed everything around her. Emily loved exploring wild places. She wasn't a person who enjoyed loud cities or crowded streets. She liked the sound of wind in the trees, the scent of fresh air, and the thrill of discovering places few people had ever been. She and her two friends had planned this trip for weeks. They carried backpacks with food, sleeping bags, and maps. Their goal was to hike to a high lake, stay the night under the stars, and then head back the next day. They had read about this hidden trail online, a place few people visited. It was supposed to be beautiful, quiet, and peaceful. But nature has a way of changing plans. As the sky grew darker, the group realized the weather was turning faster than they expected. The wind picked up speed, and the first drops of cold rain touched Emily's cheeks. Her friends checked the map nervously. The storm was coming sooner than they thought. They had two choices: turn back or find shelter. "We're too far from the car," one of her friends said, pulling the map closer to his face. "Maybe we can find a cave or a cabin," Emily replied, looking around. She wasn't scared, but she knew they needed to make a smart choice. The rain grew stronger. The forest that had felt warm and welcoming an hour ago now felt dark and endless. Their boots squished in the wet ground as they hurried down the trail. Emily pulled the hood of her jacket over her head, her heart beating a little faster. She had hiked in the rain before, but this storm felt different, stronger, wilder. Then, through the heavy mist ahead, she saw something, a thin line of smoke rising above the trees. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people, or at least shelter. She pointed toward it, shouting through the wind, "Look! Over there!" They followed the smoke until they reached a small clearing. And there, standing strong against the storm, was a wooden cabin. It looked old but well built, with a stone chimney puffing out warm smoke. Henry Whitlock, standing near his porch, saw them coming from a distance. It was rare to see anyone here, and he had never seen a group of strangers walking through his valley in the middle of a storm. Henry's instincts were careful. He didn't talk to people often. In fact, it had been years since he'd spoken to anyone face to face. But when he saw their tired faces and wet clothes, he knew they needed help. He stepped forward, raising his hand slightly, not in greeting, but to let them know they were seen. Emily saw him for the first time then. A tall man with a long gray beard, deep eyes, and a jacket that looked like it had been worn for many winters. He didn't look dangerous. He looked like someone who belonged to the forest. Someone strong, quiet, and sure of himself. "Hi," Emily said softly, trying to be polite despite the rain. Her hair was wet, and her voice was shaking slightly from the cold. We got caught in the storm. Can we stay here for a while?" Henry didn't speak right away. It wasn't because he didn't want to. It was because words felt strange on his tongue after so many silent years. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Come inside," he said in a low, rough voice. The three hikers stepped into the cabin, their wet boots leaving small puddles on the wooden floor. The warm air from the fire wrapped around them like a blanket. The smell of burning wood filled the room. Emily took off her jacket and sat near the fireplace, rubbing her hands together. Her friends were quiet, still catching their breath. Henry moved around the room in calm, practiced steps. He gave them old wool blankets, dry towels, and a pot of warm tea he had prepared earlier. He didn't ask questions. He simply helped, as if he had done this 1,000 times, even though it had been years since anyone stood in this cabin except him. As the rain beat hard against the roof, Emily looked around the cabin. It was simple but cozy. Wooden walls, shelves with jars of dried herbs and food, an old lantern hanging from the ceiling, and a small table near the window. There were no phones, no lights, no noise, only the soft crackling of the fire. "Thank you," she said after a while, her voice warm and sincere. Henry gave a small nod. It felt strange to hear another human voice inside these walls. It had been 10 long years since a woman spoke here. He didn't quite know what to say, so he stayed quiet. One of Emily's friends whispered to her, "This is like something out of a movie." A cabin in the woods and a man who lives alone. Emily smiled a little. She was curious about him. Who was he? Why did he live here alone? What kind of person chooses the mountains over the city? She had so many questions but didn't want to be rude. As the storm grew stronger outside, the four of them sat by the fire. Henry mostly listened. Emily did most of the talking, sharing small stories about where they were from and why they had come hiking. She talked with gentle energy, her eyes shining even though she was tired. Henry noticed something he hadn't felt in years. Warmth that came not from the fire but from being near another human being. When the rain finally softened, it was too late for them to walk back. Henry offered them space to rest. He had an extra corner with a few blankets. The hikers were grateful. Emily watched him carefully as he added more wood to the fire, his movements quiet and sure, like someone who knew how to live alone and still be at peace. Before they fell asleep, Emily whispered softly, almost to herself, "I didn't think we'd meet anyone out here." Henry didn't answer, but in his heart something small stirred. For 10 years he had built walls of silence around himself, and now for the first time someone had stepped through them. The next morning the storm had passed. The forest sparkled with raindrops shining on every leaf. The river ran faster from the rainwater and the sky was bright and clear again. Emily stepped outside and looked at the valley. It was even more beautiful in the morning light. Henry stood a few steps away, splitting wood for the day. He moved with quiet strength. Emily approached slowly, unsure if she should speak. But something in her told her this moment mattered. She thanked him again for letting them stay. He nodded, a small smile touching the corners of his lips. The kind of smile that takes time to return to a face that has forgotten it. When she and her friends packed their bags to leave, Emily felt something unexpected. She didn't want to just walk away and forget him. She turned back one last time, waving to him with a soft smile. Henry raised his hand slightly in return. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd done in years. As they disappeared down the trail, Henry stood on the porch, watching the forest swallow their figures. The valley grew quiet again. The birds began to sing. The wind moved softly through the trees. Everything went back to the way it was, and yet something inside Henry had changed. For 10 years, the forest had been enough. But now there was a small spark inside him, a memory of a voice, a smile, and a pair of curious eyes that didn't look at him with fear or pity, but with kindness. Emily, too, couldn't stop thinking about the quiet man in the cabin. As she walked back toward the car with her friends, the sound of his voice and the warmth of that fire stayed with her. Something about him felt unfinished, like a chapter waiting to be written. Neither of them knew it yet, but their paths would cross again. And the man who hadn't seen a woman in 10 years would soon find his world changing in ways he never imagined. The sun rose slowly behind the tall mountains, painting the sky in soft pink and orange. The air was fresh, a little cold, and the sound of birds echoed through the silent forest. This place was far away from towns, roads, and crowds. No buses passed here, no cell phone towers stood tall, and no sound of traffic ever reached this deep. Only the wind, the trees, and the flowing river kept the world alive here. Henry Whitlock stepped out of his small wooden cabin, his boots crunching on the frosted grass. His beard had grown long and silver, and his hair was rough and messy from years without a barber. His hands were strong and calloused, not because of hard city labor, but because of chopping wood, climbing rocks, and surviving in the wilderness. He had lived alone for so long that the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like home. His cabin was simple, built with his own hands many years ago. The walls were made from thick logs, stacked and fitted tightly. A small chimney sent out a thin line of smoke from the wood fire he had lit early in the morning. Inside there was only what he needed to live: a table, a bed, a shelf, and a few tools. There was no television, no phone, no light switch. At night he used lanterns and candles. In winter, he stayed close to the fireplace, listening to the sound of burning wood. Henry had once lived in a busy city. He had worn suits, worked in an office, and used to drink coffee from a paper cup every morning while rushing to work. But that life was gone now. One by one, people he loved had drifted away. Years ago, he had lost the woman he loved most, and with her, his will to keep living the same way. The noise of the city began to feel unbearable. The faces in the crowd blurred together, and every conversation felt shallow. One day he simply packed a bag and walked away. He walked toward the mountains, looking for quiet. He found this valley by accident. It was hidden behind a narrow trail surrounded by thick forests and rocky hills. Few people came this way, and those who did were mostly hikers passing through. He decided to build his life there. At first the nights were long and the silence was sharp. But as the months passed, the trees became his friends, and the river's song became his comfort. Every morning Henry followed a routine. He would start a fire, heat some water, and make a cup of black coffee on the old iron stove. Then he would step outside, take a deep breath, and look at the mountains. It was something he never got tired of. The peaks stood tall like old guardians, and their silence was something he understood. He didn't need to talk to anyone. He didn't need to explain anything. The mountains accepted him the way he was. After his coffee, he usually went to check his traps or collect wood. He lived off the land, not in a wild or dangerous way, but in a quiet, respectful way. He never took more than he needed. He grew vegetables in a small garden behind his cabin, and in summer he picked berries from the forest. He fished in the river, cut firewood, and fixed things when they broke. Every task was simple, but it filled his day with purpose. 10 years is a long time to be alone. Most people can't imagine going without seeing a single woman or any other person for so many years. But Henry had chosen it. It wasn't that he hated people. It was that he had been hurt deeply. In the silence of the mountains, he found peace. He never thought of himself as lonely. He thought of himself as free. Sometimes he would find an old photograph in his wooden box, a picture of him and a woman with bright eyes and a wide smile. He would sit on the porch at sunset, hold the picture carefully, and remember how it felt to hold someone's hand. Then gently he would put the picture away again. The stars would appear above him and the night would grow calm. He had learned to live with memories instead of people. The forest had its own way of speaking. The crack of a branch might mean a deer passing by. The distant howl of a wolf meant the night was alive. The wind carried scents, wet earth after rain, pine needles, smoke from his fire. Henry knew the forest better than most people knew their neighbors. He could tell when the weather was about to change just by looking at the sky or listening to the river. In winter, the valley turned white and quiet. Snow covered everything like a soft blanket. Those were the hardest months. He had to prepare ahead, chopping wood in the summer, storing food, making sure the cabin was sealed from the cold. He sometimes went weeks without stepping beyond a few hundred meters from his cabin. The silence was even deeper then, and the snow made the world seem endless. Henry didn't keep a calendar, but he marked the passing of years in his own way. He remembered the day he first arrived. He remembered the second winter, the big storm in the 5th year, the spring when he saw a bear with 2 cubs. He remembered small things that no one else knew. To him, these were not just memories. They were pieces of his life, carefully folded and stored in his heart. What he didn't know was that his life was about to change. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. A simple day like any other would lead to a meeting that would shake the quiet world he had built. He had no idea that a woman named Emily would walk into the same forest, with a map in her hand and a sense of adventure in her heart. He didn't know that her footsteps would echo down the same trail he had walked years ago. He didn't know she would be the first woman he would see in 10 long years. For now, he only knew the soft sound of his boots on the frozen ground. He only knew the scent of pine trees and smoke. He sat on the porch with his cup of coffee and watched the mist rise slowly from the river. He didn't speak out loud because there was no one to listen, and yet the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like an old friend. He had built a life where every small thing mattered, the way the wind touched his face, the way the first snow of winter fell softly on the porch, the way the stars shone brighter here than anywhere else. He didn't have a television, but he had the night sky. He didn't have a radio, but he had the sound of the forest. He didn't have company, but he had peace. In the city, people rushed from one thing to another, always trying to fill their time with noise. In the mountains, Henry had learned the beauty of stillness. He could sit for hours watching a squirrel jump from one branch to another, or listening to the distant call of a bird. He didn't need to be busy to feel alive. He only needed to be present. But deep inside, even if he didn't admit it to himself, there was a small space that felt quiet in a different way. A space that used to be filled with laughter, a gentle voice, or a warm smile. That space had stayed silent for years. Henry had covered it with routines, with work, with the calm of nature. But it was still there, waiting. The seasons continued to turn. Spring brought green leaves and rivers full of melted snow. Summer brought long days and soft breezes. Autumn painted the trees with gold, and winter wrapped everything in white again. Henry's beard grew longer, his hands rougher, and his silence deeper. The world outside changed, but his valley stayed the same. And so did he. He didn't know that a single step on a forest trail would bring someone new into his quiet life. But life has its own way of surprising those who least expect it. And Henry Whitlock, the man who hadn't seen a woman in 10 years, was about to find out just how big a surprise the world could still offer, even to someone who thought he had seen and felt everything.